Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabesta here. Today we've got the Heroic Raid Guide for Siegecrafter Blackfuse. And as always, if you're interested in a shorter guide, you can check out the quick raid at the bottom there, or any role-specific guides for tanks, healers, or DPS. So with that, let's get started on one of the most difficult fights this tier. Now the first consideration, as usual, is your raid composition. And more so than many other fights, the composition that you come up with will greatly impact the potential strategies that your raid can utilize. So in the top left there you can see some considerations kind of in order of importance that will help you determine possible strategies that you can use for this fight. The first is melee versus ranged ratio. This is extremely important because essentially the most basic way to put it is if you have a decent number of melee DPS in your raid group, so not counting tanks, you will be severely limited in the potential strategies that you can do. And in fact, arguably only have one strategy available, which is the one that you see in our video, because we have a fair bit of melee DPS. We'll get into more of those in the strategy sections, but that's the first consideration. If you have mostly or even all ranged DPS, you can use all sorts of strategies, depending on what your capabilities are as players, essentially. But with melee, you're fairly limited. The next consideration is the number of hunters in your raid, particularly whether you have one hunter or 0 hunters. The reason that this is important is because of the assembly line mechanic, which all raids must deal with. Hunters are particularly strong for that, because a single hunter can go on the assembly line every time, whereas normally the debuff prevents players from going up every time, and they have to alternate. So the more hunters you have in the raid, basically if you even have one, it will allow the rest of your raid and DPS to ignore the assembly line. So each hunter basically reduces the number of assembly line assigned players by 1. So in our raid, for example, we have 1 hunter, so he can go up both times, which means we only need 2 other DPS total to help handle the assembly line with him. This is assuming a pair of 2 people per assembly line, which is standard. So anyway, hunter consideration is very important. If you have 1 or even 2, 2 would be amazing, since they could both go up every time and no one else will have to worry about it. Next is the warlock count. This is mostly due to portals, and this kind of relates to your strategy methods or potential strategies, in that it allows players positioned on one side of the room away from the assembly line to quickly get to the other side of the room, very frequently. It also allows for easier kiting of things like lasers, and even escaping, various ground effects like the missile waves and whatnot. So warlocks are really only consideration due to their portal ability, and nothing else about them is really that important. Then we have the number of healers, specifically 1 versus 2. There's no point at all to having 3 healers on this fight. The healing requirement's very low, all things considered, outside of a few specific situations. So you can consider the possibility of using 1 healer or 2. Now we tried 1 healer for a while, and it probably would work, but it depends. Its success really depends on the other sort of strategy that you're using with the fight, and that is specifically, which targets you're killing on the assembly line, which one you're dealing with down here, and all that good stuff. So certain strategies, again, we'll talk about those in that section, allow you to get away with less healing, whereas the more damaging strategies, such as the one we're using here, requires more healing output. So with those basic considerations for your raid composition in mind, then we can get into the rest of the video, and you'll see where those things come into play and how it will affect your potential strategies and how your raid goes about doing this fight. So the new addition on Heroic for this fight is really 4 new additions, but they're all the same basic mechanic, and that is Overcharged weapons. So the way this works is just like in normal difficulty. When you kill one of the weapons on the assembly line, the others become immune, and those 2 weapons that you didn't kill will move across to the opposite assembly line and activate over there for a brief period. On Heroic, however, one of those weapons that activated will become overcharged by the boss. And the overcharge causes these weapons to have new, much more dangerous effects. So I'll just briefly go over those really quick here. The first, in no particular order, is Shockwave Missile Turret, which overcharges its missile turret and basically causes the missile turret to become targetable and killable. But while it's active, before you kill it, it will continuously shoot out new waves of the missile, spikes, basically, that need to be dodged until that missile is targeted and killed. And 3 of these will spawn just like the normal non-targetable version. So the faster you kill them, the faster you stop their waves. And they basically act the same otherwise. The laser turret, when overcharged, causes these 3 large, almost full circle waves to appear around the room. And these laser positions are very exact. So when the overcharged laser occurs, they're always in the same spots. And they each have 3 gaps, sort of, that appear at the same positions relative to the room every time. So you can actually find these gaps in these permanent laser spots and slide through them if you need to get to various parts of the room, to basically different concentric circles, essentially. So you can kind of see the rough diagram of the gaps from a different image that we used in our strategy stuff. And so you can see that most of them are sort of to the left, to the non-assembly area, the opposite side of the room. The third overcharge for electromagnet basically causes the magnet to, instead of just pulling everything into it one time, just like it normally does, it actually causes a continuous push-pull pattern that occurs during the duration of the overcharge. So this will suck in all the saw blades, as you see here. And once they're sucked in, they'll be pushed back out in a rough fan pattern. And this pattern is based on the number of saw blades that exist in it. So the more blades, the shorter the space between the saw blades. The important thing to note that we found is that it doesn't actually matter where the saw blades originate from before they're sucked in during the overcharged magnet. Their starting position is irrelevant. All that matters is the number of blades that are in the total electromagnet push-pull. And as I said, those number of blades will then shoot out in sort of a fan pattern, distributed evenly based on the number that are there. And then finally, the overcharged crawler mines will cause much larger mines to spawn initially. So they're like giant-sized mines. And when you destroy one of the overcharged mines, it splits off into 2 of the normal crawler mines, the smaller ones. So you essentially have many, many more mines in total to deal with, and you have to do it for a longer period, since when you kill the big ones, then they split off into the smaller version. So now that we know roughly what Overcharge does, based on the weapon it targets, let's talk about the rules for Overcharge, and that is how the boss determines which weapon he targets. Since there's always 3 weapons on assembly and you kill one of them, how do you determine which of the 2 weapons left over will become overcharged in that particular set? So there you can see the rules in the top left. The very basic rules are simple. First, there's an overcharge priority based on the weapon type. You can see the priority there. So the highest priority weapon is a magnet, followed by mines second, and missile third, and finally laser fourth. The second rule is that Overcharge will select the next weapon in the priority that has the fewest overcharges thus far. So, to put that more simply, the Overcharge ignores the priority if a weapon is available that has fewer overcharge total so far in the fight than all the other weapons. So if you have done an overcharge for 3 of the 4 weapons, and the 4th weapon that has not overcharged at all yet is available, it will automatically overcharge that weapon that has fewer total overcharges. However, if the total number of overcharges is the same for 2 weapons in the same level of priority, and they're both available, they can be overcharged, they're both available on the other assembly line, it will then select the one with the highest priority that has the same number of overcharges. So, based on those rules, we'll give a couple quick examples here to give you an idea of how it works. So, using those rules, we can now see an example chart or table here. This basically just shows the assembly count along the left, the number of the assembly line wave that you're experiencing. The next 3 columns show the assembly line weapons that are available for that wave. The destroyed column shows the destroyed weapon for the assembly team, that is which weapon they kill on the assembly line. And then finally, we have the overcharged weapon. Based on the priorities and rules that we already established, we know if we destroy one of the indicated there weapons on that line, the overcharge will be what's indicated. So, first assembly, you get missile, mine, and laser, for example. So we know that if we destroy missile or laser, it doesn't matter which, mines will be overcharged. And the reason for this is that nothing has been overcharged yet. So based on our priority, we can see that mines are higher than missile or laser. So as long as you don't kill mines on the first set, it doesn't matter which one you kill, you'll always overcharge mines first. Next, we have for number 2, mine, laser, and missile. Here, we're just killing missile. And when we kill missile, we overcharge laser. Because mines has a higher priority on the priority list than laser does. However, based on the rules, we've already overcharged mines once. So mines already has a count of 1 overcharge, whereas the other weapons, such as laser, do not. So laser will take priority because it doesn't have the same overcharge target as mines, or overcharge count, rather. On the second set, however, if we didn't kill missile, instead we killed mines, then the missile would actually be first because laser is a lower priority than missile is. But anyway, in this example, we're killing missile. So third, I won't go through the full explanation, but you can see the list there. We're killing missile or laser, and on this one, magnet becomes overcharged. Again, based on the priorities and the counts that we've seen already. Magnet is the highest priority, so it doesn't matter if we kill laser or missile, it will take precedence. And then fourth, if we kill mine or laser, it doesn't matter which, we will get missile, because missile has not been activated yet. Everything else has already been overcharged once, so missile is the highest if it's available. And then we get to the final one, fifth, in this example, where everything has been overcharged once on purpose, just for this example. So if we destroy magnet, which is the highest priority, then it automatically goes to the next highest priority, which is mines. Now, if we switch it up slightly, as we see in example 2 here, it's basically the same first 4 assembly lines as the first example. So we're getting every weapon overcharged once, just to see how it works. But in this case, instead, we kill missile or mines on the 5th. It doesn't matter which we choose, because magnet is the highest priority in the priority system, and because every weapon has an overcharge count of 1 already, so they're equal, it will simply pick the highest priority weapon available in the list. So magnet is the highest priority. It's available since we killed missile or mines on number 5, so it will overcharge magnet there. So those 2 examples, basically on number 5, give you a brief idea of how the priority system works. But just remember the rules there at the top, and then you can kind of craft the order that you want and kind of sort of determine your basic strategy from those rules. Now, the next thing to consider is the order of the weapons on the assembly line. So I'm not going to walk through this whole list, but there you can see the list in the top left there. That basically just shows you the assembly line count and then the 3 weapons that will be on the assembly line. So with this information, you should be able to plan out, based on the priority and the overcharge and all that, what sort of pattern, I guess you would say, that you want your overcharged weapons to be in. And again, this will be based mostly on your priority and the strengths of your raid members and all that stuff. But this information should allow you to figure out what you need to do and get you started. The next important consideration is how your tanks handle the shredder spawns. And mechanically, these work just like they do in the normal version. So to some degree, you can just do what you do on normal difficulty. However, killing them promptly is really important on heroic because, of course, their overcharge damage scales up the longer they're alive. So there are a few ways to go about it. And it will depend a bit on your overall strategy with how you handle overcharges and other mechanics. But the basic setup that we did was a 3-4-3-4 repeating split. So our monk tank, we have a monk and a paladin. Our monk tank would go up to 3 stacks of the electrostatic charge, and then our paladin tank would go up to 4, monk tank 3, paladin 4, and so on and so forth. They would just keep going back and forth between this. And the main reason for this is that going up to 3, you don't really need any cooldowns, arguably, but going up to 4, you kind of need 1 cooldown. But you can easily do that as a tank every time you alternate. So our paladin tank found it much easier to kill off the shredder with a 4th stack, and there wasn't an issue to allowing him to do that, so we kind of kept that pattern. Our monk tank has a kind of a burst DPS cooldown in the form of his tiger pet that he's able to use when he doesn't have any sort of ground effects to utilize to help kill the shredder. But other than that, you'll have to come up with your own sort of method for your tanks, and you can use a lot of different patterns. Many people like to go to pretty high stacks, and we tried that for a while. It works to some degree, but it's much more complicated, and especially now that the shredders have low health compared to what they used to, or lower health, I should say. It's a lot easier, in my opinion, to try to use fewer stacks and be more stable with your tank swaps. So 3-4-3 worked great for us. Again, you can give it a shot and see how it works for you. All right, so it's finally time to get into the specifics of the various strategies that you can implement, again, based on your experimentation and your raid composition, deciding which will work best for you. So the first strategy here is what I call anti-mines. And this is the strategy that our raid ultimately settled on. And I'll talk a bit about what this involves and why we settled on it. So on the top left there, you can see the basic assembly line order that will give you the anti-mine strategy. So I won't go through the full list there, but you just see the count of the assembly line, the kill target, that is what you destroy on the assembly line, and then the resulting overcharged weapon that will come out of that. So the basic idea, based on the title of course, is that you're trying not to get overcharged mines with this strategy. So the overall goal is to get the fewest overcharged mines as possible, which means one set of overcharged mines will occur on wave 6. And the reason for that is that there are 2 crawler mine sets up on the assembly line, so you cannot avoid mines being overcharged on this one. But other than that, you won't get any overcharged mines. So as long as you plan for the set on wave 6, everything else will be all the other 3 weapon types overcharging throughout this strategy. Now, on the top right there, I've just written out a few brief pros and cons to this strategy to help give you an idea of what's good about it, what's bad about it, and help you decide. So the pros, to begin, this method has the fewest possible overcharge mines, which I mentioned before, and this is great for melee heavy raids. The main problem with having a lot of melee, and again this goes back to the raid composition section at the start, is the inability to deal with overcharged mines very easily. Mines will target any non-tank players with their fixate, and this includes melee DPS that may be trying to attack them. So if you have heavy melee in your raid, using a method that spawns very few mines, like the anti-mine strategy here, will be much better for you. And in fact, I would argue the only potential strategy. If you try to do any other method, you're going to get a lot more mine sets, and I assure you we tried that. All of our raids had 2 or 3 melee DPS, no matter which night it was, and it was simply really difficult for the range DPS, even with melee helping on the assembly line as much as possible, to properly deal with those mines. So, if you have, as I said, heavy melee, this anti-mine strategy is probably going to be your best and maybe even only bet as far as strategy. The other next pro is that this is easy to heal assembly team members. Positionally, as you can see here, the raid will spend their time with the boss on the left side of the room near the assembly line, so that when assembly players drop down or pop out, whichever way they do it, they'll automatically basically be in range of your healers that are already over here, and it makes survival for those players much easier. And then finally, overall, there are very few, if any, raid adjustments for your positioning. So it's important to distinguish between raid and personal movement, but the basic idea is if you do this strategy, you will never have to move the boss or the raid in general away from their starting position. Once you get him to the left side here, as you see, he's there the rest of the fight. And so overall, that makes the movement for tanks in particular and overall raid members fairly easy. That said, there are a number of downsides to this method as well. The first of which is that this is arguably the most difficult overcharge combination created, which is laser into magnet. So you can see the laser beams there that are always in the distinct positions. You will all go from an overcharged laser, which will extend into the next overcharge of magnet on some occasions. And this can make things very difficult. This basically happens twice during the fight, and it's very challenging for raid members to handle all the mechanics because of the personal position requirements. They're going to have to avoid the saw blade push-pull while standing between the safety positions of the overcharged laser beams while all that's going on, as well as deal with the overall damage. So it can be pretty challenging. So the second thing there just talks a bit about that personal positioning requirement that comes up from this strategy. Because you have to dodge so many ground-based effects, every individual player in the raid is really going to be held accountable for their own survival and positioning throughout this strategy. And it's much more difficult than some other methods because of that. So the main thing that you have to dodge are the missile waves in conjunction with the saw blades being thrown while avoiding, static laser positions and whatnot. And then when you throw in, at times, the magnet push-pull, you also have to do the missile dodging waves at the same time, and things get really complicated really fast. So just be aware that that is a requirement. The final thing is that this strategy is probably the highest healing requirement strategy, simply because of those overcharge combinations that I talked about before. People will do their best to avoid everything, but at times, what's going on when you've got push-pull magnets plus missile waves plus lasers sitting on the ground plus saw blades being thrown out, people are going to get hit by some stuff. So the overall healing requirement for this is higher than some of the other strategies. The second specific strategy I'll talk about here is anti-missiles. And similar to the previous strategy of anti-mines, the basic idea is that you destroy all or most of one type of weapon on the assembly line to get rid of it throughout most of the fight. So in this case, of course, you're destroying missiles instead of mines in the previous strategy. The good news about this strategy is, unlike the mine method where you still have to deal with a set of mines pretty early in the fight, the missile strategy, you don't have to deal with an overcharged missile until wave number 11 at the earliest. So the fight is probably going to be over by then if you have reasonable DPS, which means you never have to deal with overcharged missiles, most likely, if you're doing this strategy. So anyway, on the top right, you can see the pros and cons again, just like we did before. So we'll start off with the pros. The basic idea with this method is that it allows for very simple personal positioning. And the main reason for this is that you have no missile waves to dodge, which means that side-to-side movement or awareness of anything for your raid members except for their general positions based on lasers or dodging saw blades is very minimal. So for the most part, your raid members, even your ranged targets for saw blades, will stay pretty much stationary in their overall positions. You'll move from sort of a central position to deal with saw blades to the far right position or the back position by the boss when magnet occurs, and then you'll just kind of adjust back and forth between these two positions. So your raid as a whole will be on the opposite side of what you see here. It will be away from the assembly line on the other side of the room. Because of that, the second pro is that this method allows for shredder tanking on the boss. So whereas In this method, because the shredder, in the mines method you see in the video, because the shredder comes on the opposite side of the room, most of the time you're not going to tank him near the boss. But with the anti-missile method, where the raid is where the shredder spawns on that side, you can actually just keep the shredder there, assuming your tanks have enough sufficient DPS, and you don't have any melee DPS, or very much of it, because melee don't want to have to run away from the shredder when it's leaping up into the air and lose DPS time. So anyway, that's just a consideration and a potential benefit to this method. And then the last pro is basically the overall healing requirement for this method is pretty low. And again, that relates to the overcharge combinations that you will, or in this case won't, see. Because your raid members are pretty much static and only move when they're targeted briefly by the shredder that's being thrown toward them, they shouldn't have to worry about stepping into bad positions during the magnet push-pull or the lasers, or when they're dodging saw blades. They only have to move if the mines are not killed off or handled properly. Downsides to this method, the main one is that there's extreme numbers of mines that you have to deal with. And as I mentioned before in the other strategy section, if you have any or even high amounts of melee DPS, this will not work. There just will be far too many mines to deal with, and not enough DPS players that can actually attack them full time. The main reason for this is that there are other mechanics that will prevent some of your ranged DPS from actively attacking the mines at all times. So even if you only have 1 or 2 melee DPS, some of your range probably won't be able to attack mines at all times. And if that occurs in a bad situation, where you have overcharged mines especially, the mines will get out of control pretty quickly. So, again, if you have heavy melee, probably can't do this anti-missile method. And then the last sort of con or consideration is that because the raid is on the right side of the room, away from the assembly line, there are frequent issues with the range of healers to the players that are coming down or going up for the assembly line. Your healers will not really be in range with those players most of the fight unless they make a conscious effort to send one of the healers over there at certain times, which is possible. We did that a bit. But for the most part, this method will require your assembly team members to basically handle their own personal damage. Now, that's easier to do because the missile waves don't exist, so when players drop down, they only need to worry about magnet push-pull damage, which is not very high, and then not stepping into lasers that might exist or something. So for the most part, without missile waves, assembly players should be able to manage themselves if they have any form of personal healing or cooldowns, but it's just something to consider. The range issues could be a problem. Let's talk a bit about handling the overcharge magnet, because this can be a little bit problematic, and again, it depends a bit on your strategy. So obviously in this video, you're seeing footage of overcharge magnet using the anti-mine strategy. So this is the more difficult version of the magnet to deal with because we can't really be in positions that avoid these saw blades when they're being pushed and pulled. So if you're using a strategy like the anti-mine strategy where you're on the outside or left edge of the room here, you're going to have to dodge the saw blades as they're coming in and out. There are two ways to do that. The first way is to technically outrange them. So as we go through these clips, well, probably not in this section here, but when there are lasers active, overcharged lasers active still, and the magnet begins, some of our melee DPS prefer to be on the outside edge of the room. So right up against the outside edge, near the assembly line there, you can be on that outside lip that goes anywhere around the room and avoid the saw blades. The saw blades, when they're pushed out during the magnet, will not go that far. You can see that they stop right at the edge of that lip. So if you're confident in your ability to navigate against the push and pull magnet while doing other things and not get hit by the missile waves, for example, you can stay on that outside edge and avoid the saw blades. So I personally found it was easier to be in the middle here and just to avoid the saw blades as they're coming in and out. But again, it just depends on your personal preference. So if you want to, you can be on the outside edge, during the magnet and never worry about saw blades flying through you. But again, if you're doing this method, you're going to have missile waves, so that will be difficult. Another possibility is to be along the back edge of the room. So basically where the boss initially starts the fight, there's that wall, so kind of in the back left here of the screen that you can't sort of see. But there's a wall there against the edge of the room. So against that wall, during the magnet, you cannot be pushed off, whereas everywhere else in the room you can be pushed off and just fall to your death. But if you're over against that wall, you can simply stay against it and not worry about being thrown off the edge and never worry about the saw blades hitting you. You also will be out of the laser if there's an overcharged laser because you're on the outside edge. So that's another possibility to avoid. And then the final possibility, which I don't have any footage of, is to basically be on the other side of the room, so not near the assembly line, but on the other one, so that you're actually outside of the fan or cone that the saw blades will travel through. So you can do this by being on the very far right or far left edge, even when overcharged laser paths are out. Or you can actually be behind, so to speak, the magnet position. Because the saw blades do not go all the way to the edge when they're sucked in. They stop about 10 yards or so out from the inner edge. So you can actually have the boss or melee sort of behind that position and not have to worry about getting hit by the saw blades when they're sucked in. So those are a few considerations, again, depending on your strategy and overall positions, to consider about handling the magnet. But it's a pretty difficult portion of the fight, regardless of what strategy you're using. So ultimately, it's probably the best time to use your personal and survival cooldowns for non-tank players, because that's when it's most likely that you'll be hit by miscellaneous damage that you didn't intend, along with the magnet ticking damage that's occurring during that period. So now we'll talk about the overcharged laser and how to deal with that. And again, these are just general tips. So it will depend a bit on your strategy overall. So obviously this footage is still from the anti-mine strategy, where we're on the left side of the room near the assembly line. But the basic idea is, since the overcharged laser pathways are always in the same positions, your raid members need to preemptively get into position to be safe from the laser waves before they actually start, or as they're starting. They travel pretty quickly around the room and form up. And once they're formed, of course, the only way to pass through them is to run just through the laser on purpose, or to travel around to the gap areas that I showed in the earlier diagram, so you don't actually take laser damage. So the way we basically did it is, with this method, we're off to the left. So our melee could either be on the very outside edge, beyond where the furthest outside laser is, so basically where the green marker is and out there, or on the inside edge, so the boss is basically tanked hanging over that outside laser area. So either the very outside or the next inner ring between the overcharged laser paths is safe for melee. Ranged DPS typically are hanging out on the path that I'm on here, so not the outer one, but the second most outer path, kind of off to the sides, either left or the right, so that they're still in range of healers, but they can dodge saw blades pretty safely and not be in danger of hitting the laser path. And then the final position is usually for one of our healers. To the left there you can see the blue marker. That's in the the second most innermost path, basically. So look on the right there, you can see where the blue is, and our other healer, our paladin healer, is hanging out there pretty much by himself. The reason he's by himself is so that other range that might be near there aren't throwing saw blades on him. He doesn't have to dodge them as much. And then from that position, he's in range to heal the off-tank, who's far enough away that the shredder isn't getting healed by the boss. So again, regardless of your overall positions or strategy, whether on this side of the room or the other side, the basic methods are still the same. That said, if you're on the other side of the room, where all the gaps between the laser paths are, you're probably doing like the anti-missile strategy instead of the anti-mines. You can basically stand in the gaps between the laser paths, and it's a lot easier to avoid both the lasers and to position saw blades off to the sides so that other players don't have to move as much. But again, I don't have footage of that, so you'll have to just see where those are based on the diagram, and then you can position yourself accordingly. Now, a few tips to avoid missiles, overcharged missiles in particular, but also the regular ones, basically revolve around keeping your camera zoomed out primarily, and always being aware of the current waves and where the next wave is likely to end up, so that you can stand just on the outside edge of the existing wave, and then once it goes off, cross over. So this is really important. So here you can see the wave coming to my right, so I position just on the side of it. Once it goes off, I move in so it goes past me. And that's pretty obvious, but it can be difficult when you're getting used to everything else that's happening. Another important adjustment there is right there you saw a missile hit right next to the melee position, where there's a laser wave already in existence on the outside edge. So what's important to note is that when a missile hits in that position, here it is again, you can actually be in a very tiny gap right next to the missile inner ring and the laser that existed there. So there is enough gap there on either side after that initial missile wave hits to avoid touching the outermost laser ring, but still be safe from the second missile wave that comes out. So, yeah, just something to keep in mind. It's difficult to describe, but you can see it here in the footage. Here it's going to occur again, but I'm going to actually go on the right and use cooldowns because I couldn't avoid the overlapping waves. So that's another consideration, is that if you're not doing the anti-missile strategy, there will be times where you have double missiles active at the same time, and they sort of overlap because one continues into the other. So those are times it's really important to have personal survival cooldowns if you absolutely cannot avoid the waves because you didn't plan accordingly or a new one popped up somewhere that you couldn't get out of it. And so finally, we'll talk about tips for handling the overcharged mines. So again, with the footage I have here, I have very few instances where we're dealing with overcharged mines because we're doing the anti-mine strategy. But the same basic tips and rules apply. With this method, with the anti-mine strategy, when you do get your one set of mines, as you see here, we're doing our best to stay on the same side of the room that we were throughout most of the fight, on the left, and then have the mines travel toward us. This forces us to drop our snares and slows in the center of the room where the mines are typically going to pass through as they come to random targets, and then have ranged DPS kill them off. Melee DPS can and should help, but as normal, it's important that your melee are very quick to react if they get targeted by freshly spawned mines, especially from the pair that pop out of an overcharged mine. So just do your best for your range to kill them off slowly, use your stuns and snares as appropriate, and you should be able to take care of them. When you're doing an anti-missile strategy or similar, where there are a lot more mine sets, the basic strategy there is to position the boss, Siegecrafter, under the spot where the mines are dropping down. This will allow your tanks that are on Siegecrafter at the time, or your tank, singular, to help DPS the mines as they're coming down, which is a lot of extra DPS. Your tank should be able to do a ton of damage on those mines. So with those sort of strategies, move the boss under the mines as they're popping down, and then all the same normal methods apply. Use your stuns and your snares where they're dropping down there instead of intercepting them, and have your ranged DPS primarily focus them down quickly before they get out of position and sort of force people to run around too much. Okay, so I think that covers everything for this fight. It's pretty insane. It's easily the most difficult heroic fight up to this point in the tier. Actually including Paragon, since we've experienced that quite a bit recently by the time I'm recording this. And arguably, based on many people's reports, this is even more difficult than Heroic Garrosh. So, just be prepared to spend a lot of attempts on this fight. This one took us a little bit over 200 attempts, I believe, and it's tough. So a lot of it will come down to your ability to, based on your raid composition and your strengths, determine which strategy your raid has to use and stick with it. We spent a lot of time experimenting, trying out different strategies to kind of see which one worked best, because we didn't really know. But trust me when I tell you all the tips that we learned in the previous parts of this strategy, particularly based on how much melee you have, hunters for the assembly line, yada yada yada. It will really help you if you quickly decide on a strategy and stick with it, and have faith that, or confidence that that strategy is the best for you, and players can learn that quickly. If you keep swapping every 50 or 75 attempts to a different strategy, things will be much more difficult and take you longer to do. So that's the best overall tip I can give, is try to figure out what will work best for your group, and then just stick with it and just grind through those attempts. Slowly, as with anything, people will eventually learn, okay, I need to watch for these things to occur at this time, and I need to dodge these things on the ground at this time, and kill these targets at this time, and so on and so forth. And use my cooldowns when this occurs, and all that good stuff. But mostly it's just a trial and error thing that ultimately comes down to getting used to the pattern that your raid settles on based on your strategy and assembly line order. So, that covers everything for the Heroic Raid Guide for Siegecrafter Blackfuse. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, please subscribe. And otherwise, there'll be plenty more coming soon. So thanks for watching, and good luck. Soul, mine, or melee. Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Oh my god.
What to do?
Nobody died, did we?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so jelly.
Well done.
We did it. I'm stuck.
Holy shit. Good job, guys.